How were the searches for unmarked graves located at former residential schools being carried out? CUTV attended a Q&A and interviewed Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Burials, Kimberly Murray. Murray is putting together a report on the matter.
Please welcome Kimberly Murray.
Sego, Seguego, Kimberly Murray, Yingatskan, Yingahaga, Neganasatake. Welcome everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. As I was introduced, I'm the Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. I was appointed with a 2-year mandate by the Minister of Justice of Canada. Part of my position is to speak with Indigenous communities and survivors of Indian residential schools that are doing the searches for looking for the missing children and unmarked burials across the country. And in that work, early on, I decided, after speaking with elders and survivors, that one of the ways that we could hear from communities, aside from me going into communities directly and attending their gatherings and meeting one-on-one with survivors and the teams that are doing the searches, was that we could hold national gatherings. And so what we're holding this week in Montreal is our 5th national gathering for missing children and unmarked burials. And the purpose of these gatherings, there's a number of purposes. One is that we want to bring communities together from across the country to talk about the challenges that they're facing with the legal barriers, with the political barriers, with issues locally to accessing records, accessing to the land to do the searches, and hear from the communities directly about those challenges, but more importantly, hear from them about how they're overcoming those challenges, and make recommendations for how we can do better so that they can do this sacred work that they're doing and get it complete for the communities and for survivors. So as I said, this is our 5th national gathering. Our first gathering was in Edmonton, then we went to Winnipeg, then we went to British Columbia, help me out. Then we went to Toronto, that was our last one, and we're spending time here in Montreal. Some of the people that come to our gatherings have been to all our gatherings. And we're really learning that survivors really need the time to share with one another and to visit with one another and to continue speaking their truths. So there is a huge need for these type of gatherings to keep being supported after my office is gone. In some senses, we're seeing that communities and survivors want to continue the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did. We have people coming forward that are survivors of the residential schools that never shared their experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC collected 7,000 statements, and those statements were provided to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We're now seeing there's more people that maybe weren't ready during the operation of the TRC to come forward that are now coming forward. And so we're balancing at these gatherings the need that survivors and the want of survivors to share their experiences in Indian residential schools, but also to talk about what they know about deaths that happen in the residential schools and about the burials that they know of. So I have a 2-year mandate, as I said. I've been instructed to make recommendations to the federal government for a new legal framework to protect the burials. And in that legal framework, to discuss how we can support communities in finding the children, identifying the children, and protecting those sites. I was required to issue an interim report. I issued that in June of this year, and in the report, and you can pick up, I think we have copies, or did we give them all out? We have them in French and English with us. And in the report, I identified 12 areas of common concern that communities have shared with me. And we're hearing those same common concerns at this gathering. And we're going to hear more common concerns. In the interim report, I made 48 findings that address some of these common concerns. And so I'll just quickly tell you what the concerns were, and I think many of you know about them. The first is access to and destruction of records. Everywhere I go, survivors talk about the need to access church records, government records, and we're not just talking about the federal government. We're talking about provincial and territorial governments. Provinces hold records, they hold death certificates, they hold records on burial permits, so it's important that the provincial archives open up as well, not just the federal archives. The second common concern was the access and protection of the sites. So I'll give you a couple of examples. If the residential school is on a reserve, Indian reserve, that doesn't have the same consequences if the land is on privately owned land. If the property, the building or the residential school is privately owned now. Some are owned by church entities, some are owned by private citizens, some are owned by Crown or on Crown lands, federal, provincial, municipal governments. Those are the ones that we're running into difficulties because we don't have a law that allows a First Nation for survivors to enter that property to search. And we have a good example here in Montreal with the Ghanistan and the search that they wanted to do at the Royal Victoria site and the Allen Memorial. They had to go to court to stop development on that site, and they have to work with McGill and the SQI in the province of Quebec to do the search. So there's a lack of Indigenous-led process on that site. So another issue is sort of the complexity and the length of time it takes to do these searches. Government funding, federal and provincial government funding, is limited. The initial funding from Canada was 3 years. Provinces have also contributed funding. It's on this 2-year, maybe 3-year cycle. This work is going to take a decade, if not more, to do all the grounds of Indian residential schools and other institutions. There are problems with the investigation process, problems with the fact that the police services that potentially could do criminal investigations are the same police services that apprehended the children and took them to the Indian residential schools. So there's a big lack of trust. We had a policing panel here today from First Nations Police Services about what could their role be in doing these investigations. But as we all know, First Nations police program is underfunded, and communities want to rely on the First Nations police services, but they don't have the resources to support communities in these type of investigations at this point. We also have heard about issues around data sovereignty. The records that they're collecting, communities are collecting, the data that they're getting from the ground penetrating radar machines, which are often done by universities or institutions that are supporting them. It's really important that Indigenous communities control and manage their own data and control and manage their own records that are sitting in archives. So Indigenous data sovereignty is a big part of what we're thinking about needs to be included in the new legal framework. I know this seemed to be the one area that there was a lot of interest in the issue of responding to the public disclosures. Every time a community comes forward and says, we found reflections or anomalies in their ground penetrating radar, There's misinformation that's being delivered in the media. It's being turned into there's 100 bodies that were found, and that's not what the GPR does, which then results in the denialism that happens across the country and violent attacks, and I call it violence, attacks on communities, whether it's through emails, showing up at the sites, trying to photograph what's happening on the site, showing up with shovels, flying drones over the sites. So there's a big problem that we have with the deniers that are saying nobody died at these institutions and nobody's buried at them. And we know that's simply not true. They died at these institutions. There are cemeteries at these institutions. They were built with cemeteries. There's blueprints that show that cemeteries were built at these institutions. So we need, we need Canadians, the governments and the churches to put a stop to the denialism, because the truth is there, the evidence is there, that there are burials. Lack of funding, ongoing challenge, especially for mental wellness supports in the communities, issues around returning land to the community. So land back, land repatriation. We know the government took these lands from First Nations people, built these institutions on them, but when the institutions were closed, the land wasn't necessarily returned. Some of the land, as I said, still sits with the churches, was sold off, and is privately owned. In the interim report, I talk about a well-known situation happening in Manitoba where we have a campground on top of a cemetery of children. And that doesn't sit right with me. It shouldn't sit right with any Canadian. So we need to fix the law. And then finally, the big question about accountability and justice. And we heard many survivors talk about that today. How do we get accountability and justice for the crimes against humanity that were perpetrated by Canada and the churches? Some of you may know survivors asked the International Criminal Court to investigate burials and the situation in Canada, and they declined to investigate. And that was a technical reason, because of their jurisdiction of when they were created. The International Criminal Court said we only have jurisdiction for crimes that happened after the Rome Statute created us. So even the UN is failing survivors today. And so we need to really think about, is there another mechanism that we can bring in, that we can create to bring justice and accountability to survivors and their families and communities? As I said, this is our 5th gathering. Our next one's going to be in Iqaluit, and we'll be doing a closing gathering in Ottawa in June when my final report will be released. So I'll leave it at that and answer questions.
So we'll field questions for approximately 30 minutes. State your outlet and ask your question. We'll allow follow-up questions if time permits within the 30 minutes. We could start over here, please. That's you in the front. Thank you.
Hi, Emilia from APTN. I'm wondering, as the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation approaches, and with all of these sort of obstacles and struggles that are happening with accessing archives and land back and everything, do you feel that we are currently on the path to truth and reconciliation, or is it still kind of, a bit of a mess?
I think it doesn't matter what I feel. I think it matters what survivors feel, whether they feel there's been some movement. Personally, I can speak about what I've seen change from the time when I worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and when the calls to action were implemented. And I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners often spoke about that reconciliation is happening more on the ground in small communities with their local governments, their local municipalities, with their neighbors, where it's not happening at the level it needs to happen with the federal government or the provincial governments. So the closer you are to the First Nation, in some cases the reconciliation has been better. But I've also seen, we can talk about curriculum, for example. During the Truth and Reconciliation process, many of the provinces and territories started to implement curriculum on Indian residential schools. And then we see changes in government. And then we saw the curriculum being pulled back. And now we see a rise in denialism. And, studies have shown, academics have said, the last step of genocide is to deny it happened. And our government, by changing curriculum and canceling curriculum, is feeding into that last step of genocide. So we need to increase education. When I talk about churches and government need to step up and address the denialism, they hold the evidence. We know it exists. They need to step up. So, but I've heard from, many survivors were happy when they received the apology from the Pope. Many survivors were happy when they received the apology from the government and thought it was a step forward. It's an individual, it's to each individual what they feel they need for reconciliation.
And if I can get a follow-up, how can media, especially mainstream media, do better to combat disinformation and denialism? I've talked to a lot of communities about this, so they're sort of taking control of their own narrative, communities, and not coming and standing on a stage like this and answering questions and just releasing written statements or videotape statements so that it can't be manipulated and changed or misquoted. So I think communities are learning from each other about how best to, I don't want to say deal with media, but how to have better relationships with media. At one of our previous gatherings, we had a whole session on working with media, and many of the communities said, you have to trust the person that you let into your community to report on the situation. And so I think more and more being more selective of how they address the media so that misinformation isn't being put out. Thank you.
In the front here? Oh, sorry, you can go.
Wendy Stewart from CBC North. We know that we're in the province of Quebec. Does it work? Do I start again? I can do that. Actually, my name is Dorothy Stewart. I'm from CBC North. My question to you is specifically in your role as the interlocutor, a special interlocutor for the what are you doing for the Cree Nation in Quebec? Can you explain a little bit what we're going to be looking for? And also, I am a former residential school survivor.
Thank you. So in Quebec, as I said, I don't think you were in the room when I started and gave my comments. So I go into communities that invite me into their communities, and so I am available to meet with any of the communities in Quebec and northern Quebec. I'm actually planning to go up into Cree territory in October to meet with the team that's doing the search up there. I've had several meetings with Anne Panasak around Bill 79, and I write about that bill and the work that she did in my report, and I frame it as a best practice. I do think the bill could have went a little bit further, and so I'll probably be thinking about that for the final report. Obviously, I'm heavily involved in the search with the institution here in Montreal of the Allen Memorial and the Royal Victoria Hospital. We got involved in the court case and we're part of the mediated settlement and are monitoring the situation. I've gone to different cemeteries and obviously addressed the leadership at the AFN and made a point of holding a national gathering here in Quebec. I can say this though, I think the work in Quebec is just starting and isn't as far advanced as in some of the other provinces. And so we help communities obtain funding from the Government of Canada and try and connect them with the right people so that they can get their processes started.
Here in front, please.
Hello, my name, I'm going to say it in English. I will try.
Merci.
So, my name is Delphine Young, I'm a journalist at Radio Canada. You told us that next year, in June, it would be the end of your mandate. I spoke with some Indigenous people here today, and they are very worried about that. They say, what's going to happen for us? What's the next step? And they feel abandoned. So what are you going to tell them?
Well, I can say this, there have been a number of letters that have been written by Indigenous leadership raising that concern about the mandate. Some have said it needs to be extended, some have said I need to have more powers, some said I need more money, all without speaking to me about it. And I understand the concern communities have about being abandoned. I have spoken to the previous Minister of Justice and the current Minister of Justice that just got shuffled in, and the Minister of Indigenous Relations, raising the issue that the work of my office needs to continue somewhere. Someone needs to continue holding these gatherings. And I will be making recommendations about what supports need to be put in place for communities. It doesn't necessarily mean that my office needs to be extended, but the work needs to continue. As I said, it's not going to be done in 2 years. And you know, I didn't talk about the other institutions that need to be searched. And we're in Quebec. Every institution was run by a church in this province, practically. The hospitals, the orphanages, the homes for unwed mothers, the Indian residential schools, the reformatories, and there are a number of those institutions that our community members have concerns. So this work is going to continue for a long time. Canada only funds the search of Indian residential school sites. I have said they need to fund the search of other sites as well. It shouldn't matter where the government took the Indigenous child to. Shouldn't matter. I just went to the Eastern Townships and visited 5 cemeteries 2 weeks ago, where there are children buried in unmarked graves in a cemetery, and the cemetery doesn't even know where they are in the cemetery, and the families don't know that the children are buried there. So I think that there's a lot more work that needs to happen, and I will be making recommendations in my final report about the continuation of the work, and certainly having conversations with the Government of Canada leading up to the final report.
Je vais poser ma deuxième question en français. Est-ce que c'est assez faire des recommandations? On sait qu'il y a eu plein de rapports avec plein de recommandations, mais ça ne vous donne pas tant de pouvoir que ça. Est-ce que c'est pas un peu frustrant? Est-ce que vous, à titre personnel, vous auriez aimé avoir plus, plus de pouvoir que juste, je ne veux pas minimiser votre travail, mais avoir plus de pouvoir que ça?
I think there are 2 parts to that question. On the question of power, obviously I would like to have power. Would I like to have power to go get those records? I absolutely would appreciate having that power. But I can't focus on what I don't have. I need to focus on the work that I need to get done that was given to me for the survivors. And as I said, some leadership have written to the government and said that the special interlocutor needs to have more powers. But I don't have powers to compel records. I have other things I can do. I've been doing those things. On the recommendation, I think you asked if recommendations is enough. I am really thinking about, as I make recommendations towards the new legal framework that I've been asked to do, I'm thinking about what's the oversight of implementing the new legal framework? Where should that be placed? And we have some entities or organizations that exist. whether that's the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, whether that's a leadership, at a political organization like the AFN, or the new National Council for Reconciliation that hasn't been implemented yet, but is working its way through the legislative process. But I do think and believe that there has to be an oversight body to hold Canada to account on the recommendations. The TRC, in its calls to action, made a recommendation that there be a National Council for Truth and Reconciliation, a National Council for Reconciliation, and the sole purpose of that council was to monitor the implementation of all the calls to action. And we're in a process right now where we're trying to implement that call to action. Maybe that's the entity that would take up this work and make sure that the legal framework gets pushed through the process.
Any further questions right here?
Hi, this is Patrick from The Nation. How has coordinating these searches on a national level gained sort of best practices that could be leveraged by other communities beginning their own searches? And have there been certain examples of that so far?
Yes, so I think, and this is the important role that these gatherings take, is showing those best practices and bringing the technicians together and the experts. Like, for example, tomorrow we have the National Advisory Council on Missing Children and Unmarked Burials holding a panel. They've prepared like a toolkit for communities about what to think about as they approach their searches. Today we had a leadership panel, where they each talked about where they started and how they set themselves up, with survivors leading the work, with what do you do first? Do you get the records first? Do you get the aerial photographs first? To the importance of multiple technologies being used, that you can't just rely on GPR. So those sharing of best practices, creating toolkits for communities. The Canadian Association of Archaeology has created working tools for communities, and they're very helpful. And so part of my role is to make sure communities are aware of all of these suggestions that are coming from the experts. And it's up to each individual community and community's team whether they're going to follow those best practices or create their own new best practices. So yeah, I mean, this is the whole purpose of these gatherings, is for communities to hear from what to do or not do.
Any further questions? If not, we thank you for your time and your energy.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for your time. You mentioned during the Q&A that the work here in Quebec is not as advanced as other provinces. Could you explain a little bit why this is?
Well, so I'll explain how I know why why they're not as far along. I get like an updated list of communities that have received funding from the federal government, and so I can see that there are a few Quebec communities that have received the funding. There were 12 Indian residential schools in the province, and so as communities are learning about the funding and we're connecting them to access the funding, then they're able to start the process. And also, I think, a lot of the residential schools are like in the north, and it's a little harder to coordinate between communities and survivor groups to be able to get the work started. And so it's a slower process than, where there's a First Nation right there, and they, everyone's right there coordinating together. So.
Can anything be done to kind of push for more funding in Quebec?
Well, Quebec appointed that individual, I've forgotten his last name, Michel Lafreniere had appointed someone that was supposed to help communities access the funding, and they had created some funding. And so it wasn't a large amount of money, and so really we need to get communities to not just access the Quebec funding, but also go to the federal government, because that's the bigger pot of money. Communities can get up to $3 million a year to do the searches, and so I think it's just a lot of the coordinating, who's going to lead it, what survivor group, what First Nation, and that has to sort of be sorted out.
In terms of which community receives how much funding, is this published? Like, is it public knowledge?
It's not something that's like listed on a website. I mean, it's government funding, so obviously it would be available like at the end in when they report on their funding. But more and more are receiving the funding and starting the process. Many focus on survivor testimony first and hearing from the survivors and collecting survivors' experiences. Others are starting with the documentary research. Some have collaborated with other entities and organizations, so they may have been started, but they haven't asked for funding. A lot of communities have university partnerships, especially with the technology. So when I say I know which ones have, doesn't mean all of them that don't have funding aren't doing the work.
Thank you so much. How many communities have you visited, or do you recall visiting since starting Randy? Yeah.
I can't answer that question.
Okay, not a problem.
I don't know, sorry, but a lot. But I've been in communities in every province, and was in the Yukon. I haven't been in Nunavut yet, but we're going to Iqaluit, and I haven't gone to the Northwest Territories yet, so we're working. I've met over Zoom with communities from the Northwest Territories, but I've met with communities across the country.
Thank you. And could you explain a little bit of what the process is like when you are invited into these communities? How do you hear these testimonies, things like this?
Yeah. So it's often a survivor gathering that is being held, a healing gathering, a wellness gathering, where they asked me to come in and speak to the survivors and the community members. And then often I go on a site visit. So I'll be taken to where the residential school was, any cemetery that may have children buried in it. Often have meeting with chief and council when I'm in the community. Always have lots of good food and feasting. And so they're usually, they look a lot the same. And then other times I get invited to a joint gathering where it's a number of communities coming together that are hosting a gathering in an urban setting where people are coming in from the communities. So I've attended a lot of those in every province.
Wonderful, thank you. And lastly, I just wanted to ask, you mentioned, sorry, I'm just trying to find it, that you were involved in the court case against the Allen Memorial and Royal Victoria Hospital. Could you explain this a little bit?
So the Ganasnasra, which is the Mohawk mothers, brought an application for an injunction to stop the development of the Royal Vic because they believe that there's potentially people buried on the grounds there. The Allen Memorial was a mental health institution, is known to have psychiatric experiments done on the patients. There is a survivor who's still alive, she's in her 80s, who filed affidavit evidence that there were Indigenous children that were taken to the Allen Memorial when she was there, and that she saw people being buried. And let me correct that. She saw people with shovels at nighttime behind the Allen. So the case went to court, to Superior Court, and my office intervened in the case because I felt that SQI, McGill, the province of Quebec, the city of Montreal were downplaying their concerns. And we do have documentary evidence that First Nations, Inuit children were taken to the Royal Vic. It was one of the approved hospitals by Indian Affairs for children to be taken there. So I intervened to tell them about the missing children in unmarked burials volume of the TRC, the calls to action in relation to missing children, to say there is a possibility. And so I just wanted to add my voice to that conversation for the judge, and they were successful in the injunction. And then we entered into a settlement agreement where we put in a panel of experts that are guiding the work and making recommendations on the search techniques and where to go from there. So we're in that process right now.
Thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure speaking with you.